Welcome to week 2 of Music, Art, and Drama. It's so good to see you. I am talking to you from our sanctuary today. This week, our story, where we left off, you may remember, we left off with Solomon, David's son, coming into power as the king of Israel. Solomon built God's temple in Jerusalem, and that was a big deal because the people of Israel, when they left Egypt, they traveled 40 years across the desert and they worshipped in a tent. And when they finally made it into the land that God promised them, they continued to worship in a tent. And David got the bright idea that he was going to build a temple for God, and God said, "No, not you, but maybe your son." And so Solomon finally did it, and it was magnificent by all accounts. It was a wonder of the ancient world. So about 60 some years or more ago, this sanctuary got built. Now, First Presbyterian Church has been around a lot longer than that. When the people who first formed First Presbyterian Church started meeting in Albuquerque, they didn't have anything nearly as big and as fancy as this, just like God's people. And then they finally built themselves a church, and then they built themselves another church, and then they built themselves this magnificent space, just like Solomon did for God. But the sad news is, with Solomon's story at least, that was kind of the high point. Things started to fall apart after that. Solomon was wise and renowned far and wide for his wisdom. People would come to see him, and all those people who came to see Solomon, well, they had their own ideas and their own gods that they worshipped, and a lot of them brought those gods into the temple as well. And it isn't so much that those ideas were bad, but they did take the people's focus off of the God who had set them free, the God who had led them out of slavery across the wilderness into the promised land. They forgot God, and when they forgot God, they forgot who they were as God's people. And soon the united kingdom of Israel fractured into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And there were kings that ruled over both of these kingdoms. Some were good and some were not so good. And because quite a few of them were not so good, at the same time that the kings rose up, so too there were prophets. Now, a lot of people think a prophet is kind of like a fortune teller. Somebody who looks into a crystal ball and can tell you what the future is, who utters some kind of incantation about some event that's going to happen hundreds of years later, like Nostradamus or something. But that's not really what a prophet is. A prophet is more like a doctor. If you do something like twist your ankle, or maybe you break your leg, and you go into the doctor's going to say, "You twisted your ankle. You broke your leg. You need to stay off it. You need to take care of it." The doctor's going to give you a few things that you need to do to make what's gone wrong right. That's what a prophet is. A prophet is someone who sees what's going on and tells the truth about it. And so these prophets sometimes saw what the kings were doing, how they were more interested in the power that they had or the wealth that they were able to accumulate for themselves than they were for God's people. More interested in what they could do for themselves than what they were supposed to do as the ones called to shepherd God's people. And so the prophets would speak up and they'd say, "If you keep doing this, things are going to fall apart. This isn't sustainable. It isn't sustainable to have these few people have all the money and all the power and all these other people who have nothing and who are starving. We can't go on like that forever." and eventually it's going to fall apart. That's what the prophets said. And some of the kings that were good listened, and they fixed some things. They took action. They took it to heart. But most of the kings didn't. And eventually, the nation of Israel and Judah, both of them, grew so weak that they fell. First, Israel in the north to the Assyrians, and then Judah and Jerusalem in the south to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, who brought his mighty army to surround the city, lay siege to it, break through the wall, and destroy God's beautiful temple. And then that Babylonian army took anyone who had anything, and they carried them away to Babylon, hundreds and hundreds of miles from home. The Babylonian army took God's people into exile, where they realized just how much they relied on and missed God's presence in the temple. There's more to the story, and you'll hear about what God's people discovered about God in exile next week with Pastor Stephen.